Tales for Dark Nights.
Always. Written by Dodger Sullivan. Narrated by Rebecca Peason. It was around the second week of early February when Sarah began to notice that something was happening to her. It wasn't a shocking discovery at first, not to say that she didn't feel a slight tinge of fear when she first came across it, but rather that she merely dismissed the confrontation as some figment of her overworked mind. Sarah was a young woman, firmly rooted in the confines of reality, and her pragmatic mind was not so easily rattled by what appeared to be something of supernatural origin. There was, she felt, ultimately a reasonable, rational explanation for even the strangest phenomena, and this belief made her apt to dismiss or ignore things that others might find unsettling. Sarah's encounter with the odd and unexplained occurred in a public restroom at the local university where she attended classes. After walking through a couple of campus buildings and coming into contact with all manner of potentially grimy and infected surfaces, Sarah felt it only necessary to wash up, hoping that the cold water would also serve to restore her senses and her full function and alertness as she went to prepare for her upcoming midterm exams. As she entered the vacant washroom, she headed straight for the sink, her vision still blurred as she had woken only a handful of minutes before, thanks to her alarm losing power at the most crucial of times. This, combined with the fact that she was already running late for class, demanded that her pace be quick to avoid judgmental, piercing glares from her peers. Sarah hastily twisted both knobs, and the water flowed viciously from the faucet, crashing downwards into the sink. Sarah cupped her hands to catch some of the downpour and threw it up into her face. The water had the desired effect, and she gave a bit of a startled gasp from the cool sting of the liquid. The water now slightly obscuring her view of the surroundings, Sarah gave a contented sigh and turned to leave for her class. Just before her view of the mirror was completely clear, Sarah caught sight of something in her peripheral vision. It had only been for an instant, but Sarah would go on to swear that she had seen a thin lock of dark brown hair fluttering just within the mirror's view. Taking into account her natural hair color was nowhere near such a hue, it could not possibly have been her own. As she always did when her path crossed something eerie and uncanny, Sarah continued on. A trick of the light, she thought calmly to herself. By the time she arrived at her class, she was already late by a few minutes. Still, it was better than skipping, she reasoned, struggling to keep her optimism afloat. As she began to make her way down to the front, she noticed that she was attracting the focus of almost every student she passed. They all appeared disgusted, shocked at her presence. Some went as far as to recoil as she took a forward step. What was their deal? Sarah gave a sharp huff and took a seat in one of the back rows, eager to remove herself from the spotlight. She crossed her arms and legs and jutted out her lower lip, fully displaying her distaste for her classmates' behavior and attitude towards her. She was not a person who expected or aspired to be popular, much less treated like a queen. But for her classmates to show such repulsion upon their first look at her was unheard of. The rest of the class went by as it normally did, save for Sarah catching the students within her vicinity taking quick glances at her when they could. The constant barrage of unwanted attention led to Sarah roughly shouldering her bags and storming out of the class the moment the professor announced its end. Wanting to get back to her room as quickly as possible, Sarah cut all the possible corners and made use of every single campus shortcut she had picked up since the beginning of her studies at college. As she continued walking, she could feel the eyes that gazed in her direction, boring into her back, filling her with a sense of dread. Sarah quickened her pace until, at last, she reached her room. She pulled out her key and attempted to place it in the lock, fumbling to open it. She wasn't sure if she was quivering from fear or rage. Maybe it was a mixture of both. Upon entering her room, Sarah flopped down on her bed, wanting to erase all worries from her mind and let the softness of her covers carry her away into sleep. Still, no matter how hard she tried, she was unable to shake those stares from her mind. Even when she hadn't seen them, she had sensed the wide-eyed, disturbed expressions of the other students, and even the inviting warmth of her comforter wasn't enough to absolve them. Groaning in frustration, Sarah sat up and firmly clutched her head in both hands. Damn headaches, she muttered silently to herself. Of course this would have to happen now. Sarah dragged her protesting body into her small bathroom, letting the natural light from her window pour in so as to avoid blinding herself with the light switch. She pulled open the cabinet that hung just above her sink and grabbed the pill bottle resting on one of the glass shelves. Taking the bottle back out to her room, Sarah unscrewed the cap and tapped the bottle lightly against her hand until 2 minuscule capsules fell out. Sweet relief, she thought. Her chronic headaches had started years before. Sarah was very susceptible to stress and had to be careful not to overwork herself. University proved to be a challenge in this regard, as a constant barrage of assignments and due dates flooded her downtime. Her doctor had prescribed her some medication to alleviate the anxiety, and so far it had been a great help in calming the raging storm of distress. Sarah swallowed the pills dry. She never needed to use water, seeing as they were so small they practically dissolved instantly on contact with her tongue. Though the pills themselves took a couple of minutes to take effect, the feeling of them traveling down her throat was enough for Sarah to enter a state of bliss. Now where were those covers? She made her way to bed and laid down once more, a new sense of tranquility washing over her. The visual cesspool floating around in her head was fading, making it easy for sleep to overtake her senses. It was dark when she awoke. I must have slept into the night, she mused. Good thing I didn't have any other classes. Sarah stretched out her limbs and let out a yawn that came out as a rasp. She put a hand to her neck and massaged the skin. Sarah rose from her sheets and, once again, headed to the bathroom, this time to get a drink for her parched throat. The lack of sunlight provided little help in her search for the bathroom. Even a master of repetition like Sarah had her limits. She groped around the wall for the light switch until she felt her hand brush up against the familiar surface. A quick flick of her finger flooded the room with light, illuminating the bathroom's contents as well as her own figure. Before she reached down to turn on the sink, Sarah stopped to take a look at herself in the bathroom's mirror. She hadn't seen how she looked all day, and her compulsiveness, which had been temporarily mitigated by the anxiety pills, was beginning to gnaw at her. Staring into the mirror, Sarah considered her reflection. Her long, wavy blonde hair fell down to her shoulders with an undisturbed neatness, not at all ruffled from her midday snooze. Her perfectly spaced blue eyes shone with a lustrous radiance. Her complexion was fair and without blemish, as was the rest of her thin, curved body. Sarah wasn't one to excessively pride herself on her appearance, but she was always thankful for the body that she had been given, and did her best to keep it in good shape. Her physique and health were within the desired range for most young women her age, but her physical appearance also played a major role in her stress, as she went to extraneous lengths in order to maintain a proper, put-together look when in public. She was about to fill her glass with water when her eye, much like before, managed to catch something that put her off guard. Her hair, right at the top of her head, looked like it had taken on some kind of brownish color. She quickly ran a few fingers through it to see whether anything had become tangled in her tresses, and then tried once more, seeing if the strange pigment was more formidable than she anticipated. But nothing was freed. The brown tinge remained. It was then Sarah's mind recalled the moment from earlier in the day, in the school's restroom. Was that mine? She thought. No, that can't be right. Her rational thinking began immediately to take over. Of course it couldn't be her hair. It was merely a trick of the light. Sarah repositioned herself in front of the mirror, hoping that the change in the light and shadow would shift her hair's hue back to its original tone. Sarah's eyes grew wide as she stared in the mirror, letting out a horrified gasp as she gazed upon her reflection. Not only had the brown tinge now spread to almost half of her entire head of hair, but her clean and unmarked skin had completely shifted into something out of a nightmare. Her soft flesh appeared to have hardened and become rigid. Small flakes, visible to the eye, were sliding off her face and arms, drifting silently to the tiled surface below. She brought a shaking hand to rub against her face, feeling the intense friction as her fingers tugged ruthlessly across its surface, causing even more diminutive remnants of her face to fall, and leaving behind a long pink trail from where her hand had been. Sarah gave a cry of alarm, clutching her face despite the immediate ramifications of doing so. She could hear the flakes falling faster each time her fingers dug into the loose epidermis, her tears, freshly formed, only accelerating the decline of her beauty. She could hear each individual thump from her heart, the sound rising with every contraction until it reached a crescendo of panic beats. Sweat mingled seamlessly with tears as her voice was reduced to racking sobs and whimpers. Suddenly, fully aware of the horror that was occurring, Sarah grabbed the mirror and flung it open to reveal the cabinet storing her medication. The stairs. Oh God, the stairs. Sarah might have had a realistic worldview and had been a firm believer in practical reasoning, but stress was the overpowering force that had dominated most of her life. It was the one thing that held her back from her full potential. It was because of those pills that she had made it this far on her own, and now they were the only thing that could save her. In her panic, Sarah attacked the glass shelves, knocking over every other bottle in the process. Routine now abandoned her as hands vigorously opened and closed, attempting to grab hold of her saving grace. In her desperate action, Sarah realized that all of her precious containers lay scattered on the floor, each one thankfully still sealed. The labels now in full display, Sarah dove onto her stomach and snatched up her anxiety medication, unscrewing the cap and almost bashing it against her hand. She hardly noticed the two objects that lay in her palm until the bottle itself was almost completely empty. Sarah stared, fixated at the two small ovals. Without hesitation, she flung them into her mouth, swallowing almost before they landed on her tongue. The feeling of the pills traveling down her throat gave Sarah a feeling of relief like none she had known before. At once, her senses began to return and her shakiness subsided. She meticulously picked herself up off the floor and turned to face the now empty cabinet in front of her. My face, she thought. Sarah swiftly drew back the door of the cabinet to the mirror stationed there. She cried out, almost as loudly as before. But this time, it was an utterance of joy. Her face was back, as if none of the abhorrent modifications had ever existed. The stress. Sarah could only sigh with a mixture of relief and elation. It was just the stress. Sarah spent the next few minutes cleaning up her bathroom, placing all her medicinal supplies back into their respective places, and shut the door to the cabinet, double-checking her face as she did so. Confirming its normalcy, she took her drink of water and walked slowly back to bed, throwing herself into it, the sheets as welcoming as they had always been. How did that happen? She thought to herself. I've been taking those pills religiously. Sarah dismissed her thoughts, choosing to accept that there had to be some form of logic behind it, even if she couldn't think of one at the moment. With her sense of routine restored and body now returning to its relaxed state, she fell back to sleep. When she woke up the following morning, Sarah gave a tremendous yawn, stretching out her limbs to their maximum. Her head was clear of doubt and worry as she was fully prepared to start the new day, untroubled by the events of the previous evening. Grabbing her things, she strode out of her room and headed for her daily class as usual. On her way there, Sarah cast quick glances out to the left and right, half expecting to catch people staring at her like yesterday. To her immense relief, everyone just continued on their way without pause, as if she were just another figure in the crowded halls. Class proved to be the same as well, with everything going as smoothly as it typically did, and no unsolicited attention focused on her. The walk back from class felt especially invigorating, as if she were floating rather than walking at all. Sarah couldn't explain the reason for this feeling, but it served as a stark contrast to the occurrences of the previous night, which made it all the more sweet. No, I'm not going back to that, she told herself, determined to put it out of her mind for good. An illusion, a trick of the mind, that's all it was. I was overworked and it stressed me out, that's all. Sarah looked down at her hands to find them clenched tightly into fists, knuckles turning pale white from the effort. She relaxed her grip and let them fall limply to her sides, resolving to go back to her room and sleep off any lingering tension. After recalling the terrible memory, Sarah's weight seemed to grow heavier as her footfalls made loud, echoing reverberations on the linoleum floors of the building. So much for walking on a cloud, she thought glumly. Sarah trudged along at a slow pace, the unwanted memory coming back more strongly with each step forward. The walk back took so long it was hard for Sarah to say for sure exactly when she first felt the sensation that she was beginning to develop some kind of an itch. It started at the base of her neck and soon began to spread all the way up to her head. She couldn't determine the exact source, but it felt as though it were everywhere, like something wriggling underneath her skin, desperate to be freed. She could feel her heartbeat accelerate as her nails clawed in her neck and face. No, she thought desperately. Not again! I'm not letting this happen again! Sarah broke into a run, set on getting back as fast as she could. She arrived at her door minutes later, her hand already rummaging around her book bag, desperately trying to fish out her room key. Once it was in her clutches, Sarah aimed to place it in the keyhole, only to miss, scraping into the metallic surface of the door, creating a quiet shriek. She kept trying, her haste hindering her accuracy, until one attempt saw her drop the keys completely. "Come on!" she mentally screamed. Her eyes were beginning to water, tears flowing down her face and onto the floor. She got down on her hands and knees and swept up the key. "I just want to sleep." At last, her trembling fingers closed around the jagged metal object and she picked herself up off the cool, flat surface, rising to face the door once again. Still shaking, Sarah was able to shove the key into the lock and open her door. She almost fell inside as she turned to slam the door, sinking to the floor in a heap. What was happening? Her thoughts were becoming a torrent, and she remained unable to decipher an explanation for her misfortune. The pills. She needed the pills. It was still a little early, but in the state she was in, consuming them now seemed to be the only logical, rational solution. Sarah rose from the ground and made for the bathroom, opening the cabinet and grabbing the familiar diminutive white bottle. The routine was a little shaky, but alive and well nonetheless. The palpable taste of relief running down her throat was exquisite, and her earlier state of zen soon returned. Wanting only to forget, Sarah lay back down on her bed, willing the medication to work quickly. "It will always be all right," she silently reassured herself. It will always be all right despite anything that happens. Her thoughts became mindless ramblings as she felt herself begin to slip from consciousness. I always have them. Kaylee checked her phone for the 7th time, hoping that she missed any recent notifications. The interface glowed with life, showcasing a very disappointing lack of unread messages. She was starting to worry. She hadn't seen Sarah since last week, which was odd considering the two were an almost inseparable pair. Sarah had told her she needed a little time alone in order to concentrate on her studying for the upcoming midterms, but now those had come and gone, and Sarah was still in a state of isolation. Kaylee was fully aware of Sarah's condition, and as her friend respected any decision Sarah made regarding her stress and anxiety. Probably just experiencing a little aftershock, she thought. God knows I am. Regardless of her reasoning, Kaylee decided to go visit her companion to see how she was faring. It had been long enough. Maybe the thing Sarah needed to feel better was the presence of a good friend to liven things up. Kaylee made her way to Sarah's room. When she reached the door, she gave it a few polite knocks and waited on a response. After a few seconds, she called out, hoping Sarah wasn't sleeping. "Sarah? It's Kaylee. You in there?" Silence. Kaylee pressed her ear flat against the door, trying to confirm whether or not her friend was sleeping. Sarah always did have a distinguishable snore. Kaylee managed to pick up a sound. Not snoring, but a faint breathing. Barely loud enough to be rendered audible, coming from the other side of the metallic barrier. She gently placed her hand on the doorknob and turned it, noticing it had been left unlocked. Probably just resting her eyes, Kaylee thought. "Sarah?" she said softly. "I'm coming in, okay?" Slowly creaking open the door so as not to disturb Sarah, Kaylee stepped into the room. It was dark, save for the thin beams of daylight filtering through the small openings in the blinds covering Sarah's window. At first, Kaylee could make out nothing, but as her eyes adjusted to the dimness of the room, she could make out a black lump in some sort of seated position next to the bed. It could only be Sarah. "Sarah?" Kaylee called out again, cautiously, her voice catching in her throat. Are you okay?" Getting no response, Kaylee brought her hand out and searched for the light switch on the wall adjacent to the door. Feeling her hand brush against the switch, Kaylee flicked her finger upwards, and light flooded the room. There was a brief moment of silence before Kaylee's scream sliced through the air like a razor-sharp blade. The black lump she sighted upon entering the room was indeed Sarah, but only just. Sarah lay on the ground in a crumpled heap, her limbs at odd, unnatural angles, seemingly on the verge of breaking. On her bare arms and legs, long, jagged cuts and scars were carved deeply into the skin, some still fresh and openly bleeding a bright, gory crimson. Her nails, most likely having committed the awful act, were caked in the burgundy pigment of dried blood. Her hair was a scraggly mess, beautiful blonde tresses now replaced with a dark, grimy brown, pieces going every which way while some lay in detached clumps at her bare feet, matching the empty patches left on her bruised head from which they had been forcefully tugged out. Her pupils appeared to be constricted to the point of being black specks, barely visible within her now cloudy and colorless irises. As the scream died on her lips, Kaylee was shaking, unsure of what to do. Her despair only rose as Sarah at last moved from her grotesque statue-like state and turned to meet her with those dead eyes. Kaylee could see Sarah's lips move slowly in a pitiful attempt at speech. As her lips parted, trying to form words, a thin trail of bile dribbled from the corner of her mouth. traveling down her chin and landing on the floor with a sickening drip. Her voice came out extremely raspy and hoarse, as if every syllable were an immense struggle to utter. From her friend's incoherent mumbling, Kaylee was finally able to make out a clear sentence, one which Sarah would only seem to repeat over and over.
They needed them. I always needed them. I always needed them.
As if in answer to Kaylee's look of horrified confusion, Sarah raised her scarred hand and opened it slowly, revealing 2 pure white cylindrical pills laying perfectly flat in her mutilated palm, matching the collection that pooled around her feet.